So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It has been a while that we had these talks. Welcome to our Feminist Political Economy Seminar. Before starting, I need to remind you that, as I told you a second ago, this talk will be recorded and shared on our YouTube channel. And for translation, for the Turkish translation, you need to choose Turkish channel by pressing the world icon, or if you cannot find the world icon, please go for the more icon with 3 dots on it and find interpretation icon where you will choose Turkish as the language you are going to listen to the talk. So as you may know, since 2006, Kültür ve Siyasette Feminist Yaklaşımlar has aimed to create a space where feminist activism and feminist theory intersect and enrich one another. In our upcoming issue, we will examine the feminist literature's discussions on economic crisis, focusing on austerity policies and possible feminist responses to them. In this context, we will be exploring questions such as: how does the economic crisis become a tool of governance? How do processes of economic crisis relate to feminist politics? What kind of feminist responses can be developed against neoliberal austerity policies? How do current working conditions transform the concept of labor? How is reproductive labor positioned within this transformation? And our guest tonight is Liz Mason-Deese, who will deliver a talk titled The Feminist Strike Against Austerity. Liz Mason-Deese holds a PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her research has looked at a range of grassroots social movements in Argentina and elsewhere, especially mobilizations of the unemployed and feminist movements, focusing on questions of labor and specialty. She previously taught at the University of Mary Washington and George Mason University, and she's currently an independent researcher and translator. Her translations include Veronica Gogo's Neoliberalism from the Below and The Feminist International, and Amaya Perez Orozco's The Feminist Subversion of the Economy, and a feminist reading of Depth by Luci Cavallero and Veronica Gago. She also co-authored and translated The Home as Laboratory with Cavallero and Gago. Thank you for being with us tonight, Liz, and floor is all yours now.
Thank you so much, Osman, for inviting me, and thank you also to all the other organizers and everyone else who is joining us on this Monday evening. All right, I will go ahead and get started. So the first strike against Macri was carried out by women. This was one of the chants that was loudly proclaimed by participants in Argentina's feminist strike on March 8th, 2017. And these women in the strike were calling attention to the fact that despite, the horrible austerity measures, the increasing poverty in the country, and so on, that the major unions and left political parties had been either unable or unwilling to call a general strike against the government's austerity measures and layoffs. It was the feminist movement instead that had organized the first national mobilization against the neoliberal government led by the president at the time, Mauricio Macri. And in doing so, the feminist movement was explicitly making a connection between the increase in gender-based violence, which was seen around the country, the exploitation of women's labor, and austerity measures. So today I want to talk a little bit about how the feminist movement was able to make those connections and how the feminist strike developed as one of the leading tools in the struggle against austerity. So let's go to the first feminist strike that we saw in Argentina. On October 16th, 2016, the 16-year-old Lucia Perez was brutally murdered in the Argentine city of La Plata. A few days earlier, the National Women's Meeting, in which over 100,000 women from across the country participated, which is being held that year in the city of Rosario, had faced brutal repression by local police forces. The big march at the end of the meeting was attacked by the police, women were injured. And these were just 2 instances of the increasing prevalence of violence against women across the country. But these 2 instances were the tipping point, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to say. So in response, women and feminists from different organizations called assemblies to discuss what to do and how they could respond collectively and forcefully to this increase in violence. In those assemblies, women got together, talked about what to do, and they ultimately decided to call a strike. But what does it mean to call a women's strike? And that's one of the questions I want to talk about today, is how is a women's strike different from what we traditionally know of as a strike, and how does it push the tool of the strike in the current moment especially? So organizers of that first strike called for women to leave their formal workplaces for just 1 hour in the middle of the day. And these calls changed later in other feminist strikes. But for this first strike, they just asked women to take 1 hour off of work in the middle of the day and to participate in marches and other mobilizations in the evening, as well as to abstain from any type of reproductive labor throughout the entire day. So that would include all types of domestic labor, care labor, as well as the labor of reproducing the gendered relationship itself. So all those forms of labor that don't get recognized, that often aren't paid, that aren't seen as real work. And participants emphasized the importance of telling, especially their male partners and family members, as well as male comrades within political organizations, that we are not here for you today, right? So even within political organizations, women said, we're not going to do work for you today. Today, on the day of the strike, they made it their mission to only do the work that was necessary to bring them together in that action. And they used the slogan, "We are here for ourselves." This action thus made visible the myriad forms of labor that women carry out on a daily basis that often go without recognition or pay. And it also served as a tool for bringing different types of women together, despite these differences, and to be able to recognize both the similarities while not ignoring those differences in everyday practices, forms of labor, and exposure to violence. And I'm going to talk more about all these things as we go on. So this effort to make women's labor visible and to link the devaluation of women's labor to violence against women is one of the key components of the feminist movement's work and the feminist strike. So as Ni Una Menos, or the Not One Woman Less collective, states in their statement calling for this strike, which was on March 8th, or International Women's Day, they state, using the tool of the strike allowed for highlighting the economic fabric of patriarchal violence. And it was also an enormous demonstration of power because we removed ourselves from the place of the victim to position ourselves as political subjects and producers of value. We complicated the category of women, workers, and made it clear that work is also domestic and informal work. And it also includes forms of self-managed association. And I think this is key here, right? Seeing women as value producers, to see the different ways that that value is being exploited, even if it is unpaid, which allows not only for rethinking labor, but also rethinking the position of women in the economy, giving ourselves a place of power from which to fight, rather than only as victims of violence, as victims of these economic policies. So, or as Veronica Gago says, speaking of that very first strike in October, she says, to strike is to challenge and block the forms of producing and reproducing life in homes, in neighborhoods, in workplaces. It is to connect violence against women with the specific political nature of the current forms of exploitation of the production and reproduction of life. The strike was the key that enabled us to unite those two things. This produced an impressive effect. First, because it broadened the idea of the strike. We started bringing together women from all different sectors, waged or not, young and old, employed or unemployed. This really caught on and activated people's imagination about how to multiply the effectiveness of the tool of the strike. What does it mean to strike in your position? Even if you are not unionized, but also if you are in an organization, in a school or a community network, for example, and so on. So again, this feminist strike, how it's different from other forms of the strike, has to do both with the labor that's being refused, but also the forms that the strike takes as women enact it. So thus, the feminist strike has been able to directly link economic precarity to women's vulnerability to male violence and to ideas about women's inferiority and disposability at the root of gendered violence. The women's strike is about work, about challenging its masculinist definition and centering women's labor, but it is also about the economic and political function of gendered violence. And importantly for us today, it understands austerity within this web of multiple types of violence. So first, I want to look at how the feminist strike has enabled the explicit politicization of questions of social reproduction. And not to go into too much detail here, but historically, the distinction between a public sphere defined as masculine and associated with production and wage labor, as opposed to a private sphere defined as feminine and associated with reproduction and unpaid labor, has served to render questions of reproduction non-political, and therefore outside of political debate and decision-making, as it hides and naturalizes women's exploitation and oppression in the home. So to understand how the feminist strike has been able to politicize social reproduction to the extent that it has, we must first take a brief detour and start from the movements of the unemployed that had arisen already in the country 2 decades earlier. So we're just going to go back in time a little bit. Organizations of the unemployed had emerged in Argentina in response to increasing unemployment and poverty in Argentina in the mid-1990s as a result of years of neoliberal policies and austerity measures. It started out as the unemployed in towns devastated by unemployment following the privatization of state-run oil companies began to carry out large and combative roadblocks, which would block major highways, sometimes for weeks at a time, to demand jobs and unemployment benefits. This tactic was then quickly taken up by the unemployed across the country. These roadblocks, which were an appropriation of the traditional labor movement's tactics of blockading factory gates, thus became the emblematic tactic of the movements of the unemployed. So here we already see a reimagining of what it means to strike when you're outside of the realm of formal wage labor. In urban areas, the movements of the unemployed often started as spontaneous protest or gatherings of neighbors, acting in response to the shock of recent job loss, to cuts to social services, and rising inflation. This inflation, which was rampant in Argentina in the 1990s as it is today, directly affected the cost of food, of healthcare, and other basic necessities, making the cost of reproduction unbearably high. It was these questions of social reproduction, the direct effects of austerity measures, that were thus central to the movements of the unemployed and became the center of their organizing efforts. They organized explicitly around issues of reproduction, protesting cuts, and calling for the state to invest more in social reproduction. At the same time, they also organized autonomous forms of social reproduction, which allowed their communities to thrive in the midst of this devastation caused by neoliberalism. So were these movements organizing in their living spaces because they had lost access to real workplaces? And this was a question posed by many major labor unions who did not see the movements of the unemployed as true labor movements because they were organizing in spaces of everyday life instead of workplaces? Or could we see these movements as a way of organizing and recognizing life's work centered in household and community spaces? In any case, the efforts of the unemployed workers' organizations began to focus more and more on issues of social reproduction, and importantly, creating their own autonomous forms of social reproduction, such as health clinics and schools, urban gardening and farming, childcare, and housing cooperatives. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. So of course, this is not necessarily new. Indigenous and peasant communities, to name a few, and those on the margins of the world economy, have long managed their material reproduction beyond or underneath the capitalist economy. Here, the borders of the domestic are more porous and fluid and expand into neighborhood and community spaces, and constantly challenging that confinement of the domestic or production in the private sphere. What makes these contemporary movements noteworthy is how they explicitly seek to challenge capital's confinement of reproduction in the household and the way in which capital has and continues to seek to devalue that work, thus make reorganizing reproduction a central public and political task. So in that sense, even prior to the current feminist mobilizations, the movement of the unemployed had already politicized the sphere of social reproduction, bringing questions of reproduction up for public debate and insisting that they hold as much political importance as questions of production. The feminist movement, the contemporary feminist movement, was able to draw on this prior politicization to explicitly take on sites of reproduction at sites where labor could be refused and reorganized. So this brings me to the second point I want to make, which is that that the feminist strike expands the definition of labor and who are considered laboring subjects. And I already touched upon this at the beginning, but by calling upon participants to abstain from all forms of labor, whether paid or unpaid, formal or informal, recognized or unrecognized, productive or reproductive labor, the feminist strike expands the terrain of the strike. It takes what has traditionally been a tool deployed by the male-dominated and patriarchally organized union movement. So in other words, a tool that had only been applied to very specific forms of formally recognized wage labor and only organized according to hierarchical and patriarchal means, and instead multiplies, diversifies, and democratizes that tool. The strike, as an action and as a process, serves a double role. It's both a political tactic and a research methodology. It makes demands and invents new worlds. The feminist strike adds another layer to the traditional tool of the labor movement. The subject of the feminist strike is not predetermined. It does not exist before the strike itself. The call to strike convenes all of us, housewives, workers in the formal and informal economy, teachers, students, members of cooperatives, the unemployed, those employed part-time or intermittently, the self-employed, full-time mothers, activists, women organizing soup kitchens and food banks, retired women, and so on. It is in this sense that the strike functions as a new form of a practical cartography of labor, but from a specifically feminist register. By calling upon all of us to stop working, the strike makes visible all of these different ways and places in which women and feminized bodies labor, again, whether paid or unpaid, recognized or unrecognized, formal or informal, affective labor, emotional labor, care labor, organizational labor, cognitive labor, material labor, and so on. These labors pile up. We can map where and how women and feminized bodies labor, and making visible a form of labor that relies on invisibility and non-recognition for its hyper-exploitation, we change its conditions. So in other words, the exploitation of this feminized labor relies on making it invisible and not recognizing it as work. Thus, by recognizing it as work, by making it visible, by refusing to do it, the strike challenges the very conditions of its exploitation, the exploitation of that labor. Again, this move does not come out of nowhere. It builds on decades of mobilizations by the unemployed and popular economy workers. And I think understanding this connection is crucial so that we don't fall into traps of a middle class or a neoliberal feminism. Together, these two movements, both the movement of the unemployed and the contemporary feminist movement, point to the complexity of the composition of labor, arguing for an expanded definition of labor itself that takes this heterogeneity in terms of its form, organization, and regulation into account and recognizes reproductive work and the work of social cooperation. Additionally, these movements point to the increasing informalization, precarization, and feminization of labor in general. So the third point I want to make, building on these first two, is that the feminist strike has been a particularly potent tool in attacking austerity because it not only calls attention to the disproportionate effects of austerity measures on women, but it also fundamentally reframes austerity as a direct attack on social reproduction and the intensified extraction of value from reproductive labor. So I'll explain this. So feminist activists around the world have long argued that austerity measures are gendered. That cuts to public spending often first target programs that directly affect women and children, and that layoffs in the public sector often disproportionately affect women. Women in feminized bodies are forced to carry out more reproductive labor to make up for those cuts in public spending. So filling the gaps in healthcare, education, childcare, care of the elderly, among other areas, when the state refuses to fill this role. So the feminist strike specifically denounced those gendered effects of austerity and linked them to multiple interconnected forms of violence. A form of economic violence in itself, the poverty, precarity, and debt of austerity measures forces women to remain in unsafe conditions. So whether unsafe working conditions or households and marriages, it makes it extremely difficult for women to flee dangerous and unsafe conditions. These were all major talking points of the feminist strike in 2017, as well as subsequent strikes. And these feminist strikers specifically called out the government's role in exploiting and devaluing feminized labor and creating unsafe living and working conditions for women. It was for this reason that strikers in 2017 were able to proclaim, as I said at the beginning, it was women who carried out the first strike against Macri. A few years later, in 2020, the primary slogan for the feminist strike was, "The debt is owed to us." And that us there refers to women and feminized subjects. And this was the slogan was a reaction against the government's recent decision to take out an enormous loan from the International Monetary Fund. Well, many of you are aware of Argentina's long history with the IMF and series of loans, repaying those loans. And then Macri takes out this huge loan again from the IMF after years of public protests against the IMF. So this slogan, that the debt is owed to us, inverts the usual equation of who are considered debtors and who are considered creditors, and argues that the real debt is owed to women for all the unpaid labor that we carry out, which sustains not only individual families and households, but also the country and the global economy as a whole. The feminist strike also pointed out how this loan came with conditionalities, such as cutting funding to gender-based programming, very specifically, including targeting programs that address domestic violence, among others. So in many ways, this loan could be seen as very clearly gendered. And just to give one example, the case of the program, which is popularly called Pensions for Housewives, is very telling in this regard. This program was the result of years of feminist mobilizations and provided pension benefits for those who, because they had worked either informally or without pay in the household for much of their lives, did not have access to pensions. The patriarchy has my missing benefits was a slogan deployed in mobilizations that brought together a wide range of feminist and union activists to demand the recognition of unpaid domestic work as labor, deserving of retirement benefits as any other labor. This program was one of the first that the IMF demanded to be cut as a condition of Argentina's new loans, and was thus a major battle cry in multiple feminist strike mobilizations, as well as other mobilizations beyond the strike. So again, the argument here is not only that these austerity measures disproportionately affect women and lead to an increase in unpaid reproductive labor, but also that these measures directly exploit and extract value from that unpaid and unrecognized feminized labor. And I think that this distinction is important to make because rather than see women only as victims of austerity or victims of economic violence, it also poses women as active agents, as value producers who have the power to fight back and the power to refuse that exploitation or that extraction of value precisely through the strike. And the final point I want to make is that the feminist strike has emerged as a powerful tactic against austerity precisely because it is able to offer concrete visions of life beyond austerity based on the collective reorganization of care, or in other words, an abundance of care. If austerity insists on a vision of care as a scarce resource, that not everyone can be fed, educated, receive medical treatment, etc., the feminist strike argues that there is enough care to go around, but that care must be prioritized and reorganized. So stepping back again, as I already mentioned, the movements of the unemployed and their roadblocks were renowned for creating alternative and collective ways of living in the midst of Argentina's economic and political crisis in 2001. After the roadblocks, the movements took their mobilizations and their organizing back to the neighborhoods where people lived and started their own cooperatives or other productive enterprises as a way of creating what they termed work with dignity. These cooperatives served both as a minimal source of income for the unemployed as well as the organizations, but they also served as a way of imagining and creating other ways of working and producing. But alongside these cooperatives that focus on more traditional forms of production, or what we could consider productive labor, many and most of the organizations of the unemployed have also created cooperative forms of addressing issues of social reproduction. They created community schools, health clinics, housing cooperatives, community gardens, soup kitchens, childcare cooperatives, and many other such projects. So in these economies, such as that of Argentina at the time, marked by experiences of economic crisis and grassroots organizing of the unemployed and others, we see that these geographies of social reproduction that I talked about earlier necessarily expand beyond the household and the nuclear family. So as we see here, women run daycares out of their homes because of the lack of public or even affordable options. Community-run soup kitchens fill in these gaps and become essential, especially as a way to combat inflation, which makes basic food items inaccessible for many people. Community-run health clinics not only provide basic care services in underserved neighborhoods, but they also run programs and interventions that are specifically related to problematics in those communities because they're organized by community members themselves. So from drug use to mosquito-borne illnesses to gender-based violence and basic nutrition. Unemployed workers organizations and other community groups have also taken over or bought land and built their own housing cooperatives that not only address the issue of affordable housing, but are also spatially designed to center and collectivize reproductive and care tasks. So including collective kitchens or spaces dedicated to childcare where childcare can be carried out collectively. Many of these projects, which again started in the early 2000s with the movements of the unemployed, became terrains for feminist organizing, since they are primarily sustained by women's labor, which was recognized to a certain extent at the time, but then became recognized more through the feminist mobilizations. So women in these projects became leading figures calling for the recognition of this feminized labor, both in political and economic terms, and for putting this care labor in the center of a new organization of society. The feminist strike has even more explicitly called for and enacted a reorganization of care. The feminist strike, as Veronica Gago and others have argued, must be understood as a process and not only a specific action or moment. A crucial element of this process involves reorganizing essential care work during the time of the strike itself, as well as during all the times necessary for organizing the strike, so all the assemblies, meetings, and other preparatory work for the strike itself. During these times, necessary care and reproductive work is redistributed and collectivized. Male comrades and family members are required to participate in this work to a much greater degree than normal, challenging gender norms and changing gendered expectations of who is capable and responsible for that labor. In other cases, groups of women collectivize that labor and rotate in and out of it, allowing more women to participate in the strike and its organization. This challenges the privatized nature of reproductive labor and instead makes it a collective problem and responsibility. While these are only temporary measures, these practices lay the groundwork for a more permanent reorganization of care that challenge and go beyond the family and other privatized forms of care, and shows that counter to the vision posed by austerity, that care is a limited resource, that we cannot afford healthcare and education, that we cannot afford healthy food and decent housing for all, that when we come together and organize in collectives, that there is more than enough care to go around. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll open up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. I want to use the privilege to ask the first question. There are so many things to unpack here, and your talk specifically speaks to us right now, considering the economic crisis in Turkey. We live the consequences of austerity measures in our everyday lives dramatically right now. And it was great to hear actually the struggles in Argentina and to take an alternative perspective towards how to mobilize struggle against it. And here I want to ask, who are the participants of the strike exactly? Because you mentioned the heterogeneity in the movement as well. So what were the sectors that were represented during the strike? And you mentioned how they were part of the labor movement, or they were part of the unemployed workers movement as well. But could you a little bit unpack here as well, like how did the real organization of strike happen? A little bit more detail about that, maybe.
Thank you, Aslan. That's a great question. So I think one of the unique things about the feminist strike in Argentina was how it was able to bring together so many different people from different ways of life. So I think I mentioned that the main organizing tool was the assembly, and these assemblies would be called, well, there are assemblies in different spaces, and sort of within organizations themselves. And so let me think. So I lived in the city of Buenos Aires, and there would be citywide assemblies, and they would be completely open. And so there would normally be, 1,000 or more people at an assembly, and there would be participants from unions and political parties, as well as, student organizations, collective of artists, environmental organizations, the groups of the unemployed or popular economy workers. In the assemblies, though, you were only allowed to speak as yourself and not on behalf of an organization. I think trying to really break down the traditional organizing form where everyone comes in with, and this again was another interesting element, was trying to break down the form of organizing where everyone comes in already with their pre-formed ideas about what needs to happen, what tools are necessary, what forms the mobilization. So I think that sort of that format of the assembly was really what was key to bringing together all these different people. And it was interesting, for example, the case with the unions, because the unions at first I think didn't have time to really think about it and initially adhered to the strike, and then later started challenging basically the feminist movement's right to call a strike, right? So the major unions would say, no, actually, we are the only ones that can call a strike. You cannot call a strike. A feminist strike is not a real strike. And this became, though, a major struggle within unions themselves, as women and also trans and queer people within unions formed their own spaces within those unions to challenge that, and eventually pushed the unions to officially participate in the feminist strike. But again, I want to say that didn't come automatically, but it came because of a lot of work and struggle within the unions themselves. And I think the other interesting thing about this was that it allowed for a lot of difference around class, which was really, and I don't want to say that this happened without conflict. There was a lot of conflict, right? Within the assemblies, you would have sometimes domestic workers in assemblies with the same women who hired them, and everyone would be allowed the same, right to speak. And so a lot of conflicts emerged. And I think, though, being in those assemblies, what allowed us to sort of really overcome, not maybe overcome, the conflicts remain, but to move forward with the conflicts was just the situation of urgency, right? That there's major crisis, that women are suffering all of this violence, that this situation cannot continue. So we're going to have to figure out a way to work together. And I think sort of that situation of urgency, but also just the method of the assembly of passing around a microphone, letting everyone have the same time to speak, really allowed for working through many of those differences. That help.
Thank you, Liz. That was a great detailing of the. I could imagined the assemblies in my mind. So Tilbakan is raising hand, but we are going to take the questions in written form if it is possible. Could you write your question on the chat box or Q&A section? Okay, now. How should we move forward after the strike? How can we concretize our demands? What kind of actions we can take to have long-term wins?
I don't think I can answer any of these questions.
Maybe you can answer it in form of like what happened afterwards in Argentina, maybe after the strike, and what kind of problems you see maybe in that process.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that like Veronica Gago and others have really emphasized is this idea of thinking about the strike as a process. And I also think about the strike in terms of a process because of the concrete alliances it allowed for. So while the strike, in Argentina every year since 2017, there's been a strike on March 8th every year. But there has also been all of these different types of actions that have arisen through the networks and alliances that were created through organizing these strikes. So for example, you can think about, I talked a little bit about the mobilizations around the Pensions for Housewives program, as well as there was a case where a number of mostly women were fired from a PepsiCo factory, and the feminist movement as a whole came together to support these women, to support. They had an encampment. The feminist movement as a whole showed up to protest with them, to bring them food in their encampment, to publicly link their demands in other places. And so I think, that way it's an ongoing process and struggle, right? Obviously, it's not over. And I see the next question is about the current situation, which, in many senses has gotten worse. But I think because there is this very concrete base of organizing that the feminist movement has been able to respond to new conditions, to new struggles, to new situations that arise. And again, I think just this this expansion, this heterogeneity of the movement allows for collectively responding to a number of different issues and also responding very quickly when issues arise.
So there is only a comment, greetings from Germany. And thank you very much for all presentation and discussion. It was very interesting. Have a good day, Dr. Bedri Şahin. And the question about current conditions in Argentina, despite significant achievements by women's movements and strong opposition, a right-wing government has won the election. How is this development being viewed and discussed by feminist groups?
Yeah, I mean, so that's the other issue, isn't it? But I think, so a lot of feminists in Argentina are currently thinking about Milei's government, the current right-wing government, in many cases arising as part of what we could really see probably as an international backlash against the feminist movement, right? And you see specifically in the way that this government, I mean, I'm in the US at the moment and very similar to the Trump campaign, has mobilized sort of disaffected young men who feel threatened by the feminist movement. And so in some ways, we can see that almost as a show of like the power of the feminist movement, that it is forcing this type of backlash that is so strong. But also, of course, as a new and very frightening challenge. And I think, you know, feminist movement has been mobilizing against Milei's government from the very beginning. Obviously, it's a very anti-feminist, anti-women government, and those mobilizations have met very strong repression, and also seen there's just the increase in both violence against women and violence against queer and gender nonconforming people in Argentina has increased even more since Milei came into power. And I think that that's something that women are trying to both publicly organize as well as create sort of less public forms of self-defense and care just to survive in the everyday. And I think, again, there's a real just issue of trying to understand how to organize in response to this backlash, like seeing it very much as a backlash that does, again, show like the power of the feminist movement, because, you know, it forces the right to react against it, but also then what to do in these new conditions. And I think, especially given the violence, that's just like a challenge.
Thank you, Liz. Now, next question is, can you give more information about the decision-making process in the assemblies you mentioned? And also about the current situation, how did this strike influence the organizational capacity of the women's movement?
Yeah, so the decision-making process, it would sort of actually differ depending on the assemblies. Like in the general assemblies, the citywide assemblies, it would, you know, be a more or less, I don't want to say consensus, but things would go up to, like, there wasn't much of a formal decision-making process. There was a sort of informal tally of like votes and energy, and if something wanted to go forward, then it would go forward. If there are enough people to make it happen, then it would happen. For writing the statements, I think I read from one of the statements today, there would be sort of a smaller group of people from different organizations that would come together and would come to consensus around those statements. And that, you know, would often take, you know, many days work to come to, you know, write a statement that all of the sort of organizations involved could cohere to. And again, I have to say, I was always very impressed by, just compared to my participation in other political movements, just the willingness to put aside a lot of other, just like sort of prior political lines, right? I think, I mean, I don't know what it's like in Turkey, but I think for me, both my experience organizing in the United States as well as in Argentina was that you normally, you know, everyone has, they're part of a political organization, you know, you have your analysis, you have your idea of what has to be done, and you go to these, you know, meetings and you say what everyone expects you to say, or you say your organization's line. And these assemblies were very different. I think there was much more. And another thing just to say about the assemblies was that they would often start with just women sharing their experiences. So they would sort of first be like a sort of almost go around the first however long of the assembly, where people would just pick up the mic and talk about their own experiences of violence or oppression, right? So not talking from some like abstract theory of women's oppression, but, like, well, this is what my boss said to me yesterday, or, my husband does this to me, or this or that. So starting from those very concrete and lived experiences, I also think allowed for just more like organic agreement to arise, because it was very easy to see that, well, maybe I hadn't had the exact same experience, but I've been made to feel the same way or experience similar forms of violence. So I think that was just very interesting, that there was just more of a willingness to find that common ground. In terms of how the strike influenced the organizational capacity of the women's movement, I think it was really crucial in a few different ways. First, challenging any sort of hegemony of like a neoliberal feminism, right? Because a strike is an anti-capitalist measure. It's an anti-capitalist measure. It's in many ways an anti-state measure. It's an anti-austerity measure. It's so it positions the feminist movement in a very specific way, as like a very like many ways radicalizes the demands of the feminist movement. But it also does so through like all of this grassroots organizing. So I mean, that was another one of the major things about the feminist movement. I talked about, people from organizations being involved in the assemblies and the meetings and the mobilizing, but also many people who weren't involved in organizations, right? Many, students who had never organized before, or young people who had never organized before, middle-class housewives who again had never organized before, joined the movement because it spoke to very clear experiences that they had. The strike itself was a very sort of easy thing to join, and then through the strike became easy to get involved in other forms of organizing. Like in my neighborhood, like a new just sort of neighborhood feminist group popped up. So all these new groups popped up, but it also, I think, as I said before, created all of these alliances and networks between existing movements that I think was crucial and continues to be crucial to respond to the conditions today, right? That instead of the sort of competition between different organizations, there's much more willingness and also just already the practice of working together to respond to issues in cases of certain new policies being implemented, or if there's a very sort of public case aside, there's already this network that can respond very quickly and draw a large number of people to the streets. And that's been created through this process of organizing the feminist strike.
Liz, there is a very straightforward question. So, what percent of the population in Argentina joined the strike? Like, what were the numbers in terms of the participants, and did it change the policies of the government at all?
I don't actually know in terms of numbers of who participated in the strike. I mean, that's one of the things about the strike. It's hard because women's labor is uncounted and unrecognized to begin with. It's a little hard to see how many people are actually abstaining from that labor on any given day. There were often, like Buenos Aires itself, there were nearly, the years I was there were probably nearly 1 million people in the streets, which is a large, I mean, there's like, I want to say like 11 million people within like greater Buenos Aires or so. So that's like a very large number of people. And, more people would participated, by abstaining from one form of work, but still having to do another form. I mean, that's the thing about the strike. It would take different forms for different women, but it had a lot of very active participation. And of course, that also varied across different cities. There are a number of, one, just probably the biggest example, of course, is the legalization of abortion in Argentina, which has long been debated in the country. And I think it was the feminist strike mobilizations that really pushed and made that legalization possible. And the legalization actually happened during the pandemic, during COVID, but I think it was only able to happen despite, these, like, after, decades of organizing, trying to legalize abortion. It was only finally able to happen because of these massive mobilizations. They really talked about abortion also as a form of economic violence, and were able to incorporate and sort of transform the abortion discourse into these terms of devaluing women's labor and women's lives. So I think is like the biggest case in terms of policy policy effects, and there are many others in terms of just like welfare benefits for women that have been won in terms of this pension for housewives I talked about, which in like the IMF. I mean, the IMF has also come in and since tried to undo many of those victories, but that were initially victories of the women's mobilization, which again is another issue.
So one last question before finishing, because I'm sure our translator is now tired enough. So Verdait is asking, first saying that I hope your resistance and solidarity will go on. And what was the situation in the rural areas or other cities in Argentina?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And of course,
Quality and quantity, she says.
yeah, so of course, like in rural areas, just because of the very conservative nature of many of these rural areas, women face just like increasing even more violence, everyday violence, both economic violence, just because of the poverty of many of the rural areas, as well as physical violence due to their isolation and due to their very conservative empirical values held in many of these rural areas. And I think it was really telling that there was quite a lot of participation. I mean, again, I don't have numbers, but there were mobilizations even in some of the most like conservative and Catholic parts of the country, in the women's strike, as well as in small towns, and even like the women's strike carried over to neighboring countries like Paraguay and Bolivia, for example. And one of the very interesting cases, I think, is the Union of Workers of the Land Workers, I guess you could call them, which is mostly small scale or family workers, family farmers. The women from that organization formed a caucus. Again, these are small family farms or, often people who don't own the land they farm, they just farm it and sell their crops and then have to pay rent for that land. And so women within, again, in obviously rural areas because they're farming, and women within that organization formed a caucus and began talking about issues of agriculture and farming from a specifically gender-based perspective and a feminist perspective, which is something that hadn't happened before, right? There hadn't really been a feminist perspective within that organization and that movement. I think the strike allowed them to see that. And they had these huge mobilizations of women from within that organization that would they would often come to Buenos Aires or other cities and talk about how the government's economic policies made it increasingly hard for small farmers to survive, how this specifically affected women, especially they talked about the debt that they were required to take out, how this led to many cases of violence within the home, as well as how, I mean, this leads to a bunch of different issues, but the use of pesticides leads to different health crises that then like women are forced to respond to through extra care labor. And then they also, the really interesting thing to me is that then they were able to connect though through the feminist mobilizations with urban movements, and often would do things like provide fresh vegetables to soup kitchens within the city. So again, the feminist movement allowed for all of these connections between urban and rural movements and allowed them to see themselves as part of the same struggle. And I think that's one of the really powerful aspects of the feminist strike.
I think that was wonderful, Liz. Thank you so much. It was so inspiring to listen to all these movements and struggles in Argentina. Thank you so much for accepting our
Thank you for inviting me.
request. Yeah, we are so happy and we hope that we will continue to be in contact and in solidarity with each other. And thank you all for coming and joining us today, spending your night with us. And thank you, Frederick Ebert Stiftung and Pınar Ecevitoğlu, and for helping us organizing this event. And thank you, Atala, our translator. She is the hidden heroine of the talk. And of course, to all the members of our journal, Feminist Approaches in Culture and Politics. Since 2006, we have been together publishing the journal and trying to bring feminist activists and theorists together to talk about the real issues. Good night, everyone.
Good night, and thank you again.
Bye, Liz.
Bye.